Hello, and I'm honored to join the LGBTQ Victory Institute in celebrating National Out to Win Day, which is dedicated to recruiting and inspiring LGBTQ people everywhere to run for office. You know, a wise person once said, if you don't have a seat at the table, then you're probably on the menu. And we need more LGBTQ leaders to run for public office so that we have our well-deserved seat at the table. You know, when I ran for Congress, very few people thought I could win. I ran against the most homophobic official in New York State politics. And with the support of the Victory Fund, against all odds and expectations, I won. And the triumph of an openly LGBTQ congressional candidate in a place like the South Bronx is a powerful testament to how far we've come. It is one example of a rainbow wave that shows no signs of stopping. And so I want to encourage all of you to run for public office and join me in shattering the rainbow ceiling everywhere in America.
Gonzalez. Happy National Out to Win Day, everyone. I'm Ruben Gonzalez, and I'm the Executive Director of the LGBTQ Victory Institute. Every April 2nd, Victory celebrates National Out to Win Day. It's a day when we want to encourage people to run for office all over the country. April 2nd is the day that we celebrate it, and you may be wondering why April 2nd. April 2nd is the day that Kathy Kojasenko won her race for Ann Arbor City Council over 40 years ago. Since her historic election, nearly 1,000 people have followed in her footsteps, and now there's about 1,000 people serving in office across the country, and we're so proud of that number. Studies show that out people from our community, women, transgender folks, people of color need to be asked multiple times to run for office. They want to be encouraged. And so we want to be one of the first people to ask you to run for office. The truth is, America needs you, our country needs you, our states need you. We need people like you to step up and run. And we hope that we will be able, through this conversation, to demystify some of that decision making around running for office and answer some of the questions that may be in your minds about what it takes to run for office and when you know it's the right time. Today, I'm joined by an incredible group of elected officials from the Victory family. Congressman Ritchie Torres was the first out Afro-Latinx person elected to the U.S. Congress. Representative Daniel Hernández from my home state of Arizona was first elected to the Arizona House in 2016 after serving on a school board. Justice of the Peace Evelyn Rios Stafford made history in 2020 as the first out trans person in Arkansas. An ANC commissioner from our home here in Washington, D.C., Rehana Mohammed, was elected and is serving her first term as an ANC commissioner. I'm really excited to be talking with all of you, so thank you so much for joining us. I would love to just start off around the room and ask, why is it important for an LGBTQ voice in your role? Why does it matter to have someone in this space? Evelyn, I would love to start with you on that question.
Sure. As you mentioned, I'm a first-time candidate, first openly trans person elected to office in Arkansas history. And I think it really helps in terms of visibility, that we are human beings and not just talking points. And we know that with, studies have shown that with greater visibility, that can help change hearts and minds. And another reason I think it's important is being a possibility model. Right now in our state, with our state legislature in session, trans youth are under attack in unprecedented ways, from sports teams to access to healthcare. And all LGBTQ people are under attack right now in terms of medical treatment. So I think having a platform helps young people. It helps those folks who are just coming out to know that there is someone like them in their corner in a public role who's helping to amplify their voices. And hopefully as we add more voices, we won't have to deal with these kinds of hateful bills in the future as there is more visibility. Another way specifically matters to my role is marriage equality. Justice of the peace are often called on to perform marriages. And unfortunately, when same-sex marriage became the law of the land, many of my more conservative colleagues decided to stop performing marriages entirely. So me being in this role helps ensure that there's one more option for same-sex couples to know that they can turn to, who's someone who's part of the community for that service.
What an incredible role and such a neat role to play in the happiest days of folks' lives. That's really rewarding for you. So congratulations on your election, and thank you for doing this. I think you really get at the heart of why Victory does this work. Having LGBTQ voices around the table, around decision-making, being able to act on or implement policy changes the conversation, and we're grateful for all that you are doing. Rehana, I would love to hear about sort of on the hyper-local level. Why is it important to have an LGBTQ voice in something that represents a neighborhood?
Yeah, so in addition to everything that Evelyn talked about, which I agree with, I would say the other piece of it is that, queer people are everywhere. And so every issue is a queer issue. When it comes to housing policy, when it comes to small businesses and supporting our businesses and our communities. And even I'm chair of the Public Space and Transportation Committee for my local ANC. And public space and how we use public space, how we share space is a huge issue that impacts the LGBTQ community. One of the reasons that I decided to run was because there are sex workers working in my district, and they were experiencing a lot of hate and vitriol from the representatives in my area for doing their jobs. Sex work is work, and that in particular is an issue that impacts the LGBT community a lot. So I think that it's important for us to think about on a broader picture that queer people are everywhere. We access government services. We need to have not only representation, but have our interests and our particular needs in mind when people are designing those government services so that they're ones that we can more easily access.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I continue to be struck by in doing this work at Victory is this notion that if we don't say it, if we're not at that table, sort of having that perspective, being able to speak up on behalf of members of our community that may be doing that work, there may not be someone else to say that, right? If you weren't there, someone else may not be having that perspective. And so it's so important, and for all of us to be represented. I really appreciate that you're doing this as well. Representative Hernandez, how about for you? Why is it important for the state legislature to have a LGBTQ perspective?
Yeah, well, thank you, Ruben, for having this conversation. And I'm so excited to see Rehana and Evelyn, because I got into this because I wanted to see more women in office. I first got involved in politics because I wanted a woman president. And at 17, I couldn't understand how we had 44 white guys and no women or people of color. And I'm reminded of Shirley Chisholm's quote that if you don't have a seat at the table, you bring a folding chair. And I think so much of what we do at the Victory Institute and the Victory Fund is really about bringing your own chair, because many times no one is coming to us and saying, you would make a great candidate. It's people in our own community saying, why don't we have somebody who looks like us? And then for my own story, I've never run for office just because. I've always put other people ahead of me, because even though I've been in office since I was 21 at 2011 when I ran for the school board, I waited until the day before the filing deadline because I thought there was people who were better qualified, who had more experience, who would do a better job. And then I looked at the field, and the only other person I was going to run was somebody who was running because they had an axe to grind and they wanted to fire a principal at a school district. And I said, well, if that's the best they can put up, then maybe if I don't know everything, I am dedicated and I'm passionate and I will learn what I need to know how to do my job. But I'm in here because I care about making sure that kids have better futures. When I ran for the legislature, I spent 11 months trying to find somebody that could win a seat that had been lost in the last election. And I spent 11 months trying to find somebody else, and I Dick Cheney'd it because I ended up saying, it's me, I'm the best candidate. But it took that 11-month process before I came to terms with saying, I'm the right person for this race. And I see this happen all over the country with LGBTQ folks where they say, I'm not the right fit. I don't look the right way. I don't sound the right way. And we question ourselves in this. There's huge imposter syndrome that we all have to overcome before we even dip our toe into running. And that's why I think Out to Win and all of the different initiatives that have happened over the years with the Victory Fund are so critical, because when we get to see ourselves at the table, we are no longer thinking about being the first. We're thinking about being the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth. And that's what's really important, that we are not the first and only, but that we open that door and take a seat at the table by bringing our own folding chair. We were joking right before this started that I keep doing these statement pieces So I'm wearing my gay agenda shirt. And that's because when we are out and we are visible, it is so much harder for people to attack us, to go after us. But they still do it. I'm in the Arizona State Legislature where we had a fight on banning conversion therapy bans because there are Republicans at my legislature who don't want us to ban conversion therapy. And they're going so far as to preempt localities, cities and towns from being able to put in their own ordinances to stop conversion therapy. So we need to be visible. We need to be vocal. But above all, we need to run for these offices because I'm here to tell you, there are so many unimpressive, mediocre people running for offices because nobody else is running for them. And we need more people to step up to the plate and run because that's the only sports analogy I know. But it's so critical that we get more people fired up and running for these offices at every level, from ANC all the way to the federal level, because we need our community to be represented every step of the way.
And that's such a good point, Representative Hernandez, that these fights are happening at all levels. Fights that we thought were sort of done. We probably sitting here thought we're probably safe from conversion therapy, and yet here we are fighting this again and fighting these sort of basic things and fighting for marriage equality after the Supreme Court, years after the Supreme Court decided it, still having people that want to push back against it. And so I think it's really important to know that we do have to fight these things at all levels and continue to keep fighting. Evelyn, you're a first-time candidate, a first-time person holding office, but also a historic first in Arkansas. I would love to hear from you just a little bit more about how do you take that on? What does that feel like to wake up in the morning and know that you are doing something? Does that weigh on you, or do you not think about it when you go into the office as you're getting dressed for the morning?
I don't necessarily think about it every day, but I think in a way that I do think about it is that I think, to me, a big importance of this role is thinking about being aware of how my decisions affect the LGBTQ community, not just the LGBTQ community, but other marginalized communities, in our area. Honestly, it's still, I think, shocking to me how some of my colleagues don't seem to take that into consideration at all in any way, shape, or form. So it just underscores, kind of the importance, of being in that role and having that be top of mind.
And when you decided to run, were you conscious of that you would be the first person, the first trans person in Arkansas to win in an elected office? Were you conscious of that weigh on your decision at all?
I was conscious of it. I tell the story. I think I actually first got inspired to run in 2018 when I met Mayor Anise Parker at a victory event in Little Rock in 2018. And it was a fundraiser for the first openly lesbian candidate in our Arkansas legislature. Mm-hmm. And that is really when the light bulb first came on, that I thought, wow, maybe I can do this. Because I'd worked on other people's political campaigns before, but I never really considered that, that I could do it. And it kind of, a lot of my thought process echoed what Daniel was talking about with the imposter syndrome and everything. Even though I got a lot of government agency experience being on the board of our local housing authority, and I was a real advocate. I've been a real advocate for affordable housing. It wasn't something that I necessarily thought that I could take on, and I became an accidental candidate in a way. I've been thinking of running for city council before the pandemic hit, but we ended up having a slate of other good candidates, including the first out African American man for our city council. And with the Black Lives Matter movement that we had last summer, I decided it was more important for us to have that representation for us. But in September, all that changed. The original candidate for this seat, Candy Clark, was also an out candidate, but she fell seriously ill and had to drop out of the race, unfortunately. And that was in September, 2 months before the election. And I made the quick decision to step up and run for the seat and put a whole campaign together in 2 months. But I won. I ended up winning with 66% of the vote, which is amazing. And it just goes to show that there was really no reason for that sort of imposter syndrome,
right,
in a way. But it was like a 2-year process for me to think about, should I run or should I not run for something?
And that's amazing. And I love that you're telling a story that shows that there are out people in Arkansas that want to run. So many folks think that LGBTQ people can be elected in West Hollywood or in Washington, D.C. or New York City or in these big cities. And I love that we're here to show folks that you can run as an out person across the country in any place that we have folks like yourself and Rosemary Ketchum in West Virginia and other people that are sort of defying people's conventional wisdom about where out candidates can run and win. So thank you for doing that and for sharing that story. Rehana, I would love to hear from you about how you decided to pursue the ANC position. Do you consider this sort of an entry position for a future political career, or is it something about the neighborhood? How did you decide what you wanted to run for?
Yeah, so I'm a little similar to Daniel's process, I think, is that, I was always sort of interested in someday running for office, and I was a Victory Empowerment Fellow a few years ago, and so went through some of the Victory training, kind of to be prepared when a role came along that made sense. And I actually decided to run for this ANC role because I reached out to my commissioner and didn't get a response. And like, well, I can do that job. And there was no one else running. This person had run unopposed for 2 rounds, and so I threw my name in there and decided to step up. And I think it's partly like, for me, making sure that I can add value in the role. And the thing that I love about being an ANC is that it's nonpartisan, it's hyper local at the neighborhood level. It really is just about me trying to help 2,000 of my neighbors access government services more easily. And I really love that. So in terms of whether it's an entry point to something else, I really don't know. At this point, I'm just really enjoying getting to know my neighbors and getting to know the DC government better and how it works. And we'll see in the future. But I think the important thing is to be connected to your community, be connected to these different coalitions, so that you're part of these conversations of, well, this is a seat we want to target. Who can we think of that would be a good fit for that, right? So it's important to be interested.
Daniel, you talked about imposter syndrome and sort of overcoming that, and part of overcoming that for you was seeing the mediocrity that was already out there in the field and realizing that you were the folks that were already sort of slated to be running or that you thought might be running. I want to hear just a little bit more about sort of what that process was for you in terms of dealing with that imposter syndrome, and just what questions did you ask yourself? How did you, what decisions did you make before running? Talk a little bit more about how you sort of got through that imposter syndrome, because I think that's a big barrier for people when they're thinking about this.
I love that question, because I think so much of what stops LGBTQ people from running is fear. A lot of what I see when I'm talking to folks that are potential candidates that would be 10 times better than the alternative is the fear of losing, the fear of their families, being put in the spotlight, the fear of people knowing more about them. The funniest thing for me is when people come out and are running for office and they haven't laid any of the groundwork. And every time I talk to an LGBTQ candidate, they've thought about everything. They've thought about how it's going to impact their finances, how it's going to impact their families, how people may perceive them. They've already had 8 different scenarios in their head about fights they're going to have, about questions and how they're going to handle things. But at the end of the day, I think the fear is really one of the motivators for us to say, okay, if I'm afraid, that's not a bad thing. Because if this were easy, if this were something that I didn't have any kind of questions and didn't have that moment of introspection, then maybe I shouldn't be doing this. But I think what we need to do is lean into that fear and say, fear is a good thing because it prepares you. It makes you get ready for the fight. And a lot of the times there is going to be a fight. It's a fight for fighting back against people who say you're too much of this or too much of that. Every time I've run for the offices that I'm in now, I've been told you're too fat, you're too short, you're too tall, you're like too many of anything. You're too young. Wait your turn. You're not the right fit. Do you really think an X person can win this race? And I've heard it even in the last couple of months where people say to me and to my sister and other folks, when you are different and when you don't look like what's always been in place, people are threatened. And they're threatened because they don't know what you're going to do. But the reality is, when we're talking about some of these local offices, like what Evelyn and Rehana do on a day-to-day basis, they're not bringing in a gay agenda to the ANC. They're not bringing a gay agenda to Arkansas. They're talking about bread and butter issues that impact their communities. And I think that's the thing. There is no gay way to take out the trash. There is no lesbian way to do a wedding ceremony. There is just people doing these jobs. And what I think we need to do is lean into that fear and accept that being fearful is a good thing. And then say, okay, now that I'm understanding that I can and should do this, what am I going to do to actually make it happen? And that's where I think the Victory Institute has such great resources for helping kind of do the training. And then on top of the training, helping connect us to other people, because I can't tell you how many times I've called people who've run for offices. So I have good friends like Jeremy Moss in Michigan and Sam Park in Georgia who are legislators, and I will have some random idea and I'll be like, I'm going to text them and see what they think because they're in similar positions. The network that you create, especially when you attend one of the trainings, is so crucial because those are the people that you lean on. Sean Malloy, who's the political director at Victory Fund, I've known him for 11 years. We did the Pittsburgh training back in 2011 before I ran for school board. I still keep in touch with him and still talk to him all the time about, I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about that. So I think leaning into the fear, acknowledging that what you don't know you can learn, and no one comes in fully ready for any position that they're in. And the last thing that I'll say, because I talk too much, Ruben, you know this, is really understanding that when you are running for office, you are not running as the gay person or the lesbian person, and not letting folks kind of label you as that. Because look at Danica Rome in Virginia. Every time I talk to her, she talks to me about that damn road or highway in her district. And I know more about that road in her district than I do about some of the roads in my district. But that's because people may try and label us as the gay candidate or the trans candidate. And for fundraising, it's helpful to be the only person, and then you get to go to some donors. But the reality is, when people are voting for an elected official, they're not voting for this gay agenda that I'm wearing. They're voting for you as a person. And you are not scary as a person when you get to meet people one-on-one, when you talk to small groups, when you knock on their door and you tell them, this is why I care about our community, and this is why I'm running.
Well said. Victory Institute last month released a study on women running for office. We actually interviewed and did focus groups with women who had run for office or who thought about running for office, and did a survey as well. And one of the things that came out of that survey was this piece about fear that Representative Hernández touched on. Fear for our families, fear for our own safety, fear for being able to pay our bills. Evelyn, I'd love to hear from you about fear. Did that sort of play into your decision-making process, and as you were running for office, how you dealt with some of those fears that may have been founded or unfounded?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. It was part of my decision-making process. It was a concern. I did have concerns about that of how am I going to be sort of framed, or this being Arkansas and part of the Deep South, like what kind of attitudes am I going to face? I will say that to his credit, my opponent completely focused on the issues and not my identity. So that wasn't necessarily a factor in the race itself. And being in I'll say it's a very red state, but this local area where we're at is a very blue dot. We're where the university is, we're where the Walmart headquarters is. It's probably the most progressive corner of the state. But the overall reaction turned out to be very positive. So, I would say, prepare for the worst, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. And definitely, reach out, for the community for support, and don't let fear hold you back. Because you can sometimes, find allies in unlikely places. A lot of what I did, and advice I would give to someone else is I did keep kind of what, Danica Rome's playbook sort of in my head when I was running, of like, run on the issues, not the person that I am. My goal was to find out what the community cares about and to focus on their hopes and their worries, instead of necessarily making the focus about me. And I think that was a winning strategy.
Absolutely. It's one of my favorite parts of Arkansas. I'm happy to see that the community there rally behind you and had you have that big victory at 60%. That's really exciting to hear. Rehana, in a place like Washington, D.C., people assume that it might be easier to run as an out candidate. Talk about, did you have fears of running as an out candidate or running as an out person of color? What was that like for you to sort of deal with in a place that's people assume is much more progressive and much more willing to vote, and there's a community here that you can kind of be a part of. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So with DC, I mean, we have the highest proportion of our population identifying as LGBTQ in the entire country. And so I think that there's a lot of that assumption that, oh, it's just any other day. But I mean, I was very concerned about running initially because I'm also Muslim and a woman and bisexual, right? And so all of these identities, all of us have intersectional identities when we bring our full selves to a role or to the table. So I actually had my campaign sign ripped down twice while I was running. And when I was talking to the local LGBTQ newspaper about it, they asked me, do you think it's because you're bisexual or you look like a lesbian or something? And I was like, I don't know. It could be because I'm Muslim. It could be because they don't like my haircut. It could be because they find my posters just ugly. I mean, who knows, right? But it definitely was stressful going into the situation and thinking, especially with it being such a hyper local role, I didn't have a separate campaign office. So my home address was on my posters because it was required by the campaign finance laws. So it's definitely nerve-wracking that when my signs got ripped down, my wife said, now I hope they didn't keep them. They know where we live. But I think that for me, what was really important was being able to lean on my community, lean on other LGBTQ commissioners who had run and won in their districts in DC. And they had a lot of wisdom, a lot of camaraderie throughout the campaign and after I got elected that really, really carried me through those experiences.
Mm-hmm. Daniel, can you talk about your connection to LGBTQ community or other groups that sort of helped support you and help you get through even your first race and as a school board member or your race as the state representative? How did the community sort of rally behind you? Do you feel like they did?
It is so interesting because when I first ran for school board, I tried to not even spend any time talking about who I was and just talked about the issues. And it came up twice during my school board race. I had two older folks who said, "So we heard that you're a gay," or some variation of that question. So in my first race, it wasn't an issue. In my legislative race, because it was a much larger race, I was running to represent 250,000 people. The community rallied behind me. I had people come in and knock on doors, make phone calls. My favorite fundraiser of all time is still a drag show fundraiser at the local gay bar in Tucson called IBT's, where Tempest du Jour, who was on RuPaul's Drag Race, headlined. And I then had to go to the bank with about $1,100 in crumpled up dollar bills and figure out, how do we report $1,100 in $1 bills? And what ended up happening was the drag queens gave the donations themselves. So we split it up amongst the three. So I think for me, it was really fun to see the community seeing the value of getting involved and each one finding a way that they were comfortable being involved, because not everybody wants to go knock on doors. Not everybody wants to make phone calls, but there were people who were making posters or people that were driving volunteers who didn't want to knock on doors themselves, but would go and drive folks around. So I think one of the things that I found and really appreciated was giving opportunities for people to be able to step up and to really show us what they were comfortable doing, and then exploiting all that as much as I possibly could during the election to make sure that we got the votes needed. So I think it's been really great. And it's also been a great sounding board, because I talk to folks throughout Arizona now as a legislator who have never felt like they've had a voice. And that's why I started the LGBTQ caucus, because we went from 3 openly gay members to 5. And I said, let's become a caucus. Let's start having stakeholder meetings and providing a voice, because 5 gay Latino men is not an LGBT community make. So I think it's been really great, and giving people, I think, their first entree into this policymaking arena, and then seeing them develop and get more involved over the years. Because it's really easy to have them come to one thing, and then we keep asking them and getting them more engaged, and eventually have them run for offices themselves.
Right. There may not be a gay way to take out the trash, but there definitely feels like there's a gay way to fundraise. And nothing makes me more proud than hearing the stories from our community and from our candidates and the innovative ways that they're doing fundraisers, because I feel like they're so much better than the fundraisers that are out there. So I love the drag queen fundraiser.
No wine and cheese, just drag queens.
Right. We have just a few minutes left, so I would love to just hear from everyone on the call about some words of wisdom. What would you say to someone who's considering running for office? Evelyn, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I would say, just in general, don't let fear hold you back. Focus on what's important to your community. And echoing kind of what Daniel said, I didn't have time to go into it, but definitely our local LGBTQ community really stepped up and helped volunteer to help make this win possible. And I really got to thank everybody in our local community to do so much work behind the scenes. And there's a lot of passionate people out there, and hook into that.
That's great. Rehana, words of wisdom?
Yeah, I would say do it, run. Treat this as your first ask, by attending this event. You've clearly been thinking about it, so do it. And I know that we've talked a lot in this conversation about imposter syndrome, but there was a really compelling piece that I read recently about how we need to stop telling women that they have imposter syndrome and reframing to acknowledge that there are these historic, institutionalized, pieces of the puzzle that are holding us back, and that's by design. And so I would say, if you take one thing away from this conversation, it's that you can win, and there's support out there for you. So just get in touch, get those networks going, and we'll help you win.
Awesome. Representative Hernández?
I get the last word. Yay. It's my favorite thing to do. I love to talk, but one of the things that I love doing is being around people. And I think what I have noticed over the years is our community is one that has had a lot of challenges. But for all of the challenges, we find joy in weird places. We find joy in our company and in our relationships. But the one thing that a lot of us are afraid to do is ask for help, because we've had to tell other people that we're strong enough to do everything on our own. We've had to fight against our families in some cases, against religious institutions. We are always fighting. So it's really hard for us to accept help sometimes. But the reality is, when you run for office, when you're thinking about jumping and taking the plunge, we need you to ask for help, because we will be there to help, but we can't do what we don't get asked to do. So please reach out. Talk to the folks at the Victory Institute. Talk to those of us on this call. I can't tell you how many times I've had people thinking about running for office all over the country saying, can I talk to you for 20 minutes on Zoom? I have a couple questions. And many of us will make the time because we know how scary it is. So ask for help, reach out, because we are here for you. We really need you to run for office, because there are so many mediocre people in these places, and we need better people like you to run for those offices.
Absolutely. And thank you, all three of you, for joining us this afternoon and sharing your wisdom, sharing your stories. I am inspired by hearing your stories, and I hope the folks watching are too. If you are interested in running for office, reach out to someone at Victory. We have lots to talk to you about, and we have trainings coming up. We will be doing more training this year, both virtually and hopefully in person by the end of the year, and we are ready to help you run for office and win. Thank you, everybody. Please share this video with somebody that you think should run for office as well. Lots and lots of people to run, and happy